For essentially one of the first times in my lifetime, the United States military, under the orders of President Trump, has actually been killing people who are actively trying to kill me, kill my friends. And so naturally, the left have been saying that they're going to put everyone who supports this in prison, just as they like to imprison anyone who actually works towards the interests of Americans, against the interests of criminals, drug dealers, terrorists, etc. Now, that being said, there are, of course, some things to discuss strategically about kind of the dynamics surrounding these strikes against the narco-terrorist boats. And so we will discuss the logistics of what's been happening, how the left is creating a hysteria around all of it to derail the Trump administration and essentially signal to everyone like, yeah, you should probably stop now and quit because when we get into power again, we're just going to put all of you in prison. So, all right, counterpoint, never surrender. So we will talk about some of these like stupid so-called conservatives who are once again allying with the left in this hysteria because, yeah, like with any political coalition, you're going to have a broad range of interests being represented. And because Trump took the correct stance against these like disastrous Middle East wars, we've had a lot of this like anti-war, man, like that kind of sentiment being laundered into Republican politics. And so we're not pro-war, but we're also not anti-war, okay? We are patriots. We're perfectly happy to use the military when it's actually in the interests of Americans. You know, human rights, war crime, nice try, liberal. These are made-up terms. These are just like libtard vocab words. It's not even real. These are just fake words made to confuse people to how conflict actually works, how it's always worked. So in any case, we will discuss all of this. Do stay tuned. Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the John Doyle Show. Look, the world is a mess. The world is an angry place. But with all the uncertainty in the world, there are some things that are guaranteed. You know, we tend to kind of construct these elaborate ideas of how the next day, the next year, the rest of our lives will go. But oftentimes, of course, things play out very differently than we expect. Fortunately, there are some anchors. There are some anchors that we can use in life to kind of ground ourselves, some things that we can reliably count on to happen in the future. You know that the sun's going to rise, you know the seasons will change, and we know that the left, of course, will take the side of the most despicable people imaginable in literally any given situation. We all know they do this. We've seen them do this. They know they do this, and they do it intentionally. I mean, just look at how the left has reacted to the deportation of Kilmar Garcia. Remember that guy? Literal, like, MS-13 gang member, literally, like, abusing women, abusing children. They lost their collective minds over the Trump admin's efforts to get this guy out of our country. They acted like he was this, like, innocent victim of a fascist dictatorship. And now nobody remembers. Nobody even talks about this anymore. But for, like, 3 weeks, this was all they could talk about. You know, you would think that they could find better martyrs. They've got murals to George Floyd, Kilmar Garcia, Martin Luther King, just very depraved people. Very much of that cloth, of the leftist cloth. But criminals aren't the only class of undesirables that they're willing to circle the wagons around. You may have seen recently the newest moral crusade is stopping the Trump administration from going after narco-terrorists. If you've been paying attention to the news at all, you've probably seen what I'm kind of talking about. Basically, this starts in early September. President Trump announces on Truth Social a new offensive against the Tren de Aragua narco-terrorists, who are, of course, responsible for an ongoing effort to flood the country with drugs. And the post also, naturally, in very Trump-like fashion, included footage of the strike. And in the video, which is very epic and cool, you can see this like small boat kind of making its way across the ocean. And suddenly it's like simply obliterated by a missile. It erupts into flames. And then the video just like ends, like it's over. And Democrats predictably denounced the strike, saying, you know, this is further evidence of Trump being like a dangerous tyrant or whatever. His temperament in charge of the launch codes, like that kind of thing that they've been leading up to for 10 years. But uniquely in this case, he did not let this stop him. He did not let their complaining deter him from continuing. He actually stayed the course, authorized further strikes. And to this day, I think the campaign has killed something like 80 people, destroyed like 20 boats. And yeah, we can be sure that they've also prevented like copious amounts of drugs from entering into our country. You're seeing reports of like street drug prices increasing already. Like obviously this is working. Obviously, I mean, you're talking about like literal boatloads of drugs that we are stopping from entering into the country. That is incredible. That is an accomplishment. Don't get me wrong. Like it's great that Trump has got Pete Hegseth wiping out these people, preventing them from bringing this poison into our country. But of course, you know, let's not forget that killing the drug smugglers, that's not the main focus. The main focus is stopping the drugs from coming in. All right, that's what's important here. Whatever. So the outrage campaign over this grew even more, actually, when it was revealed that during the first incident, again, early September, that the U.S. struck the boat not once, but twice. And the Washington Post wrote about this. Apparently, they said that Hegseth told his subordinates to, and I quote, just kill everybody, just do it, just make America great again. And so they're saying that this spoken directive led the special operations commander who was overseeing the attack, Frank Bradley, to authorize a subsequent strike on the boat after the first one left two survivors just like, clinging to the wreckage of the ship or whatever. And they're saying that this subsequent strike, which in military lingo, I guess, is known as a double tap, they're saying it's not only freaking unethical, but it's also illegal. And that's the real reason they're causing such a fuss about all of this. They want it to be illegal because they want to put everybody involved in this operation in prison. They want to put Pete Hegseth in prison. They want Frank Bradley, the admiral, the guy who pushed the button. They want him in prison. They want the guy who made the coffee that morning at the Pentagon in prison. They want me in prison for just reacting to it as a fan. Everybody, the whole list. The next Democrat president is like 100% going to try to imprison everybody involved at any scale of this. They're saying that, by the way, and they won't just stop there. If the Democrats ever regain control of the federal government, it is going to get ugly very quickly. I mean, imagine like month one of Brandon admin, except this time like accelerated. And contrary to what Trump's ostensibly, supposedly right-wing haters will tell you, this administration is actually representing like the greatest setback for the American left basically ever, at least in its modern iteration. And you may recall our now totally vindicated discussion, and I will be more specific because there are a lot of those now vindicated discussions that we've had over the years. But this is the one about a year ago where we discussed the bloody nose that would be the second Trump admin, and that Trump was going to need to make serious moves, not only to score victories for the base, we like that, but also more importantly, in some ways, I guess, to dismantle kind of the avenues that these people have for waltzing back into power, of which there are probably about 4. And if he fails to do enough damage, then it doesn't really matter what else occurs. It doesn't really matter what other victories we rack up in the meantime, because the fact that he won in itself is enough to conjure malice and viciousness from these people that our country probably hasn't seen. Like, if you think it's been bad so far, political prisoners, assassination attempts, encouragement of assassination, celebration of assassination, just wait. Just wait. Never wound what you can't kill. And all of our destinies are tied to the success of this man. Unfortunately, so far, yes, this administration has had a lot of successes, and so the left has been forced to watch as Trump undoes decades of race communism. He implements the largest mass deportation agenda and campaign in American history, fires literally hundreds of thousands of federal workers. All of these things are just casting debris and just breaking up roads within these aforementioned avenues of libtard power. That is good. This time around, the Trump admin, they have a much better understanding of what can be done with the presidency. But the left still has far more institutional power than the right. Trump might be in the White House, but overall, we know the left is still far more powerful. They control all of the opinion curating institutions. Pretty much everyone in the world who matters is like committed to the leftist cause. I'll stop there, not trying to blackpill. The point is that the tree line is not exactly in sight yet, right? This being the case, the more you attack a powerful foe, a foe who is far more powerful than you have to be ready for the counterattack. It's inevitable. And that's why it is of literally like vital importance that J.D. Vance be able to succeed Trump, right? It's not enough to just have a Republican in the White House, guy in a red tie. You need a Republican who's actually willing to fight the left. Can we trust someone like Ted Cruz to do this? I seriously doubt that. I don't think we can. It's never happened. It's just like freaking epic Senate go-off moments that my dad sends me on Facebook, stuff like that. And that's all it's ever going to be. And I think that the people running the Trump administration are aware of this dynamic. I mean, how could you not be, right? At that level, you're Pete Hegseth. The entire news cycle has been talking about putting you in prison for 2 months now. It's not hard to interpret the message at that point, right? Especially considering that there's now recent precedent for just how far the left is willing to take this stuff. It's not just talk anymore. But that's a big part of the reason for why the left is doing this. It's about creating this kind of warning, this chilling effect. They want the patriots in the Trump administration all the way from the president down to the lowliest of aides and staffers, literally the coffee boys. They want them to be afraid of what must be done to make America great again. They want them to be afraid of actually doing that. They want to send a message that says, hey, have fun. You know, do your little DC LARP, post your little pictures, do whatever, because we're going to get back into power. And when we do, we are going to eat you. And that's totally unacceptable. You know, we can't have our guys in government being paralyzed by fear into just going into, like, you know, passive mode, inaction. And a lot already have. I mean, that's what Marjorie Taylor Greene was doing on CNN, right? She goes on CNN to apologize for her participation in toxic politics. What was that all about? I guess, like, at some point between the Trump mugshot and the Charlie Kirk assassination, like, some people had it become real to them. Like, it's not just a game, actually. And she even said, like, oh, what do you think, I'm supposed to keep going until they kill me too? Yeah, actually, what, you're too good for that? You deserve a better ending than that. Charlie, the young father and patriot, could roll those dice every day, but you can't. We call that desertion. We call that cowardice. You are a traitor. And if you possess that kind of instinct, by the way, like that instinct for self-preservation, such that you will actually abandon the cause and betray the people who counted on you to represent them and to fight for them because, like, you're worried about how it may affect you personally, like, just go. Go live your pathetic sewer rat life. It's just reprehensible behavior. Apologizing to the same left that broadcasted and like the incitement and the celebration of these assassinations, these attempted assassinations. Mr. Hegseth, if you can hear me, like, these people just need to go away. Very legally and very coolly, but they need to go away. So that's the point. There is going to be a counterattack. We know this. However, I would also say very affectionately that we must make sure that our extrajudicial killings are very legal and very cool. It's important for people in the Trump administration to follow the law and order, okay? We like that because, as we just said, if Democrats get back into power, they're going to try to put us in prison. I accept these terms. Fine. But that doesn't mean that the answer is to do nothing. It just means that in order to get the job done, just be very careful with how you go about it. Make sure you do it by the book. That's my only concern with, like, the double tap thing. Sure, it's example like 1,000,000,004 of public outrage being manufactured by the mainstream media. However, I do hope that our guys in the admin aren't getting careless, given the stakes, given the bloody nose, right? What they're provoking in these people. I don't want to see anybody end up in prison due to some moment of, like, recklessness, right? And that isn't to say that Hegseth or his subordinates did anything wrong, because they didn't. I mean, according to that very same Washington Post report, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel published an opinion, quote, that asserted that because the U.S. was in an armed conflict, personnel taking part in military strikes were following orders consistent with the laws of war would not be exposed to prosecution. Perfect. The key to a good war crime is making sure that you're not in a war and it's not a crime. So yes, it's reassuring to hear that Trump's DOJ did its due diligence with this, but still, the left is claiming, obviously, you know, this is a freaking problem. The two narco-terrorists who were killed by the second strike were legally protected because they were clinging onto the boat for dear life. Ay Dios mío. And according to the Geneva Convention, which is something that a bunch of people just made up one day because they were bored, a combatant is considered to be, or the combat, which is like out of combat, it's like French or whatever, when he surrenders or is incapacitated and thus unable to continue fighting. But is that even the case here? According to Dr. Brian Cox, who's a law professor at Cornell, former Army Ranger, the journalists spinning this narrative actually have it all wrong, of course. He cited the latest edition of the Law of War Manual to defend the administration's actions, showing that the manual actually states that a person is only considered to be, or the combat, out of the fight, whatever, under circumstances where it's feasible for the opposing party to accept the surrender. Okay, well, we haven't seen the footage of the second strike, but I'm guessing those two drug smugglers, the narco-terrorists, they were not really in a position to surrender. Like, who are they going to surrender to? Do they speak English? Are they going to, like, yell it out? Is Hegseth supposed to, like, get on a speedboat and just, like, go out there to personally accept the surrender? Like, excuse me, gentlemen. Hi, yes, it's me, Pete Hegseth. I'm here to accept your surrender. Do they, again, even speak English? How would that work? It's a funny mental image, but it is clearly in practice ridiculous. Plus, how do we know that they wouldn't try to go down fighting? Like, do we know that they didn't have sidearms? Do we know that they didn't have knives? Why do we always have to give the benefit of the doubt to people who, like, 5 minutes ago were trying to kill us all? So with that said, still, we've, of course, all seen how the judiciary has been weaponized against patriots in recent years. So my point isn't that because of care and forethought, there's suddenly like a 0% chance that a future Democrat administration tries to go after Hegseth, other people involved in this campaign. The point is that what the left is presenting as like a clear-cut example of the Trump administration breaking the law is actually not very clear-cut at all. And curiously, none of the media coverage surrounding the double tap mentioned what the Law of War manual from the Department of War says about being out of the fight or the combat, right? I wonder why that is. Could it just be that maybe the mainstream media is trying to just like concoct this controversy to turn people against Trump? Could it be the people claiming Hegseth is a freaking war criminal are just out to get him? We know the answer. These questions are naive in the year of our Lord 2025. They're trying to create this narrative to just justify shit they were going to do anyway. A manufacturing of consent, if you will. So to be clear, I don't think Trump did anything wrong. I don't think Hegseth did anything wrong. I think it's awesome that this administration is bold enough to blow up drug smugglers. I've had kids I grew up with robbed of their futures because of these drugs. I think it's great that the president is willing to take it there. I only care about them following the law in this regard so they don't end up in prison. Like, if you're going to take it there, you have to be extra careful so that when the counterattack comes, which it will, it's defanged, right? Judges can throw out cases. People can defend you. Lawyers can defend you. They can work with you. And personally, I think it's absolutely absurd that the literal, like, scum of the earth can put millions of dollars worth of drugs on a boat and attempt to smuggle it into our country. And yet somehow they can be afforded all of these like legal protections. People in our country who took an oath to protect us are like willing to go to bat for them. I don't think foreign narco-terrorists are actually due any process, actually. I think everyone who contributed to this country for its first 2 centuries would probably agree with that. So, yeah, kaboom. Like, they're in international waters smuggling drugs. That is an insane person activity. Can you imagine doing that? Like, can you imagine just waking up every day and that is your thing? That is what you do in life? If I were out there on a boat smuggling drugs in the ocean and I got, like obliterated by a missile, or I realized like that was about to happen to me, I would be fair with that. Like, I would be okay with that. I would look up and say like, okay, I probably deserve this, right? You can't really blame them at that point. And if I'm being completely honest, I can maybe understand the adventure behind it, like a pirate's life, right? But that also means like part of that game is that sometimes the people you're trying to harm or rob, like sometimes they're going to try to kill you. And you can't really have an issue with that. Like, that's like how the game is played. However, I'm going to guess that the kind of guy who decides to become a narco-terrorist doesn't really see the world that way. Accepting responsibility for your actions, especially when you're doing evil stuff for personal gain. It's not exactly the most common thing in the third world. John Doyle talked about this on Monday. It's almost as if these Europeans, right? Us Europeans in the Anglosphere, wherever, we have this like profoundly different worldview than people in other parts of the world. It's almost like we forgot that people who grew up in favelas and jungles, they don't really share our notions about morality and personal responsibility, things of that nature. It's almost as if we've inflicted immense harm on our civilization by failing to account for these painfully obvious realities concerning how people, cultures, not all of these things are just the same. They're not just completely interchangeable. And I regret even ascribing or entertaining like this thirst for adventure to these people as some kind of explanation or potential motive. They're just evil and not very smart. They're not pirates, not even in the cool way. And it's precisely these kinds of people, like the drug smugglers, the narco-terrorists, these like literal scum of the earth. These are the people whom the left is bending over backwards to defend. They see footage of the U.S. military like epically blowing these boats up, and they just seethe. It makes them upset. They really just don't want you to be able to do that. They hate to see something happen that makes a white boy cheer. They hate anything cool. And what's worse is they don't want you to know that you can just do that. The left doesn't want you to know that the solutions to so many of these problems that we are facing in America and in the West are actually extremely simple. They don't want you to believe that a better world is possible. Why do you think the left hates Nayib Bukele? For decades, liberal NGOs, academics, politicians, they lectured us. They inundated us with this knowledge, this wisdom about poverty and crime. They told us, you can't actually end crime without funding social programs. They told us, you can't end crime by fighting it. But then one guy comes along in El Salvador, once literally a murderous hellscape, and he says, hey, we actually know who's committing the crime, so I don't know, we're just going to like lock them up and kill them if they resist us, and we're just going to kind of see what happens. And so that's what they did. And you know what happened? The murder rate dropped by 98%. 98%. That's unbelievable, but it's real, and the left hates it. They even make mini documentaries about it. I watched one. about him, about his ascent to power, his government, and they go and they interview the locals and everybody's happy and they're excited. They're outside for like the first time ever. They love this guy, their dear leader. And then it will cut to some sad person like, he took my brother. And it's like, was your brother in a gang? He just had the tattoos, but he was good. And then this like dramatic music plays and we get some sad text about human rights. Give me a break. Boo! Boring. Boo! Bukele proved you don't actually have to listen to the so-called experts on crime and poverty who have not solved crime nor poverty. You can just take care of business. It isn't easy, but it isn't complicated, okay? It's actually very simple on paper. You just need a little courage. And while El Salvador and America, yes, they're very different countries, the lesson still applies to us here. If we have the will to do what must be done, if we have the will to restore order, one might say, one might foreshadow, then most of our problems can actually be solved. You can actually increase the quality of life. And of course, with that in mind, it's clear that the manufactured outrage about the strikes on narco-terrorists exists to derail the Trump administration, the Trump agenda, as does everything. Because if Trump manages to decrease the flow of drugs into our country by literally just like blowing up drug smugglers, then just think of how many people will be humiliated. Think of all of the academics, all of the journalists who spent literally decades, entire careers, lifetimes, saying that the only way to stop the drug trade is to give more money, more handouts to people from third world countries, to third world governments themselves, to accept more immigrants, whatever. They're like people who want to send social workers to try to disarm knife-wielding black schizophrenics, right? Instead of sending like police officers. These are just fundamentally unserious people. They are clowns. They don't really even want to solve the problems. They want to solve the problems in a way that just serves their interests and justifies their ideology, which is to say, just charging you to make the problem way worse and harder to solve. And they would rather not solve the problem than do anything that doesn't serve those interests anyway. They are employees of the establishment. They are prostitutes, except with less integrity and like not straight. And in all honesty, it's frustrating that we even have to have these discussions in a saner society, in a reality-aligned society. Whether or not it's good to kill foreign drug smugglers would not even be like up for debate. It would be something that everyone more or less agreed on, regardless of their auxiliary views on things. That's the insidious thing about leftism. By continuously just like dragging the country leftward, it prevents both parties. It prevents Americans from establishing a kind of like consensus on basic stuff, even when one used to exist within our parents' lifetime. You see this with crime. Look at the 94 crime bill. Joe Biden supported it. And it's so bad that we were taught to hate him by the right for doing this. You see this with borders. Hillary Clinton, she called for a border wall. Social issues. Barack Obama, even in 2012, opposed gay marriage. But Cthulhu swam leftward, of course. And now what were once common sense positions have become stigmatized as far-right extremism. You want to play a fun game? Play this with a libtard. Ask them what is an acceptable iteration of conservatism. They always say, oh, far-right this, Nazis that. Ask them what their version of an acceptable iteration, manifestation of conservatism would be, because apparently they're fine with disagreeing. They're fine with other ideas. It's just Trump and these ideas that are really freaking bad. Okay, got it. So show me where the line is then. Go on. Draw the line. Draw it. You can't do it. They genuinely believe that anyone to the right of Hillary Clinton is literally a Nazi. And it's not their fault for believing that. We have to be charitable. We have to be patient. They are normies. High-performing normies are still normies. Don't make it personal. They don't know any better, but we do. And so that's our victory condition. We haven't won until positions now viewed as far-right lunacy, insanity, those are now considered the center. These are considered the median position. So long as the debate is over whether men can become women, whether we should even have freaking borders, whether narco-terrorist drug smugglers have the right to personally surrender to Pete Hegseth via speedboat, so long as that's the case, we haven't won and there's more work to do. And I'm not going to tell you to stop. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to tell you to not take it there. But we have a small window. So if you're scoring points with the base by killing bad guys, broadcasting it on Truth Social, hey, thumbs up, read truth. But just be sure that you're covering other bases too, because if these people get back into power and they can just pick up right where they left off, get right back on the horse, it's not going to be very cool, okay? They're going to come after us so hard, you would almost wish that you were a narco-terrorist, and it can't happen. But in the case it does and you would like to cope, let me tell you about our friends over at Flying Ace. Some bourbons are chasing trends. Flying Ace chases legacy. This is straight bourbon the way it was meant to be. It's bold, it's balanced, but it's also unapologetically pro-patriot. No gimmicks, no fluff, just real whiskey made for people who still believe in hard work, high standards, doing things the right way. Whether you're winding down after a long day or raising a glass with good company, Flying Ace will deliver every time. It's not about hype. It is about heritage. It is about getting back to what bourbon was always supposed to be, returning, if you will. So if that sounds like you're kind of poor, it is time to pour it, right? And you start by going online at flyingacespirits.com using code BLAZE for free shipping. Very exciting stuff. Now, discussing this story today, I did want to bring someone on who, of course, could provide some kind of expertise, some kind of intimate knowledge of the subject matter. The closest I found is our good friend who I guess has some experience with inhalants, but maybe not some of the stuff that's being affected by the efforts of the Trump administration. We're bringing on to the program the one, the only Patrick Casey of the Restoring Order podcast. How you doing, Patrick?
Doing well, John. I'm honored to be here on one of the first episodes of the John Doyle Show.
That's right. That's right. And you haven't been personally affected by these measures. That's correct. I mean, it is not targeting the sort of nitrous or whippets or whatever you guys get up there get up to in those urban areas.
Yeah, well, contrary to what you might have seen on social media, I don't actually do drugs. That's just kind of fan fiction that people. I know you know this, but apparently some people on the internet find these parody tweets. They take them at face value. So. No, I haven't personally been affected by the strikes on narco-terrorists trying to smuggle drugs into our country, which is a good thing because I really like them and I support them, and I would hate to be adversely affected by them.
That's right. Yeah, you're telling me this now for the first time that I shouldn't just believe everything I read on Twitter.com. I'm going to have to make a note to the side to sort of guide my future experience with that website. But I did kind of want to start by asking, obviously you're a millennial, I'm a Zoomer. You have a better memory of sort of like the post 9/11 military culture or like kind of pro-military Republican culture that we seem to, as people in my generation became politically aware, reject because of this like knowledge we had about the Middle East wars being disastrous. But I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on like, is this just XP farming off the base? Boomers obviously being excited to see the use of the military, maybe even my generation, your generation being excited to see a use of the military in a way that is actually reflecting the interests of American people? Or is this actually just like a real priority? And if people enjoy it, then like, hey, that's all the better.
So I guess it really remains to be seen the extent to which this campaign is effective. So far, it's so good. I mean, I think Trump has killed 80 drug smugglers, over 80. He's sunk like 20 boats. We don't know the full extent of the drugs that have been on those boats just because they've been blown up. But, the problem with drug smuggling in this country is huge. It's not just fentanyl, which people like to talk about. It's any drug you can imagine, really. And none of this stuff should be making its way into our country. And the preventative measures used for the past few decades might have worked to some extent, but clearly the fact that there's a huge problem still is evidence that you need to think outside the box, try something new and try something bold. And I think that's exactly what President Trump has done. So if after, a year or two of these sorts of strikes of this campaign, the numbers say that it's not really worth it, well, I'm fine with still doing it because these people deserve to suffer consequences for their actions, which is one of the reasons I like this campaign. It's half you're making sure that drugs don't make it into the country, and the second half is you're dealing out justice to the scumbags bringing this stuff in. So, but you're right to draw attention to the fact that it is kind of red meat for the base. I'm including myself in that. I remember when Trump posted that first Truth Social, which turned out to be from this, the September 2nd strike, where there was a second strike and it was this whole thing. But yeah, I remember seeing that and thinking like, this is awesome. Like, this is great. I would love to see more footage of my government killing just like the absolute scum of the earth.
Yeah, I agree. It reminded me of the mission in Call of Duty 4 when you get to control the AC-130 and you're just like launching these missiles, you know, at the people, little like white silhouettes on the ground, and you just hear this very like casual, you know, just like kaboom, like every time you just like take out like 5 or 7 of these like evil people who are trying to harm our guys. You know, I have noticed there hasn't been as much pushback to this from the usual suspects who would ally themselves with Democrats, of course, to try to impede the Trump agenda. There has been a little bit. And I noticed this too with like talks, you know, when Greg Abbott, for example, was pontificating about possibly using like the military or the National Guard or something like 2 years ago to enforce the border under the Brandon administration. And you did see like a decent amount of people who are nominally like on our side saying that like, no, this is bad. We're supposed to be anti-war. And I wonder how much of that remnant is left, because obviously with any political coalition, you're going to have a bunch of interests being held together. And I think because of Trump's outspoken opposition in 2016 to the wars in the Middle East, it did kind of put up like an open sign to a lot of these like freaking like anti-war people to come in and call themselves Republican, but then actually oppose use of the military in any case, or even somebody like Rand Paul, who is putting more effort into opposing these strikes than I think pretty much anything he's ever done actually in DC. So yeah, I want to get your thoughts on that. Like, you know, how do we square this action with the sort of applause line of like no new wars or something? I mean, I don't think this is a war. It's simply military action. It's obviously not the same thing, but to the retarded mind, this is not so clear. So how can we illuminate and red pill the retarded who could be so useful to our political coalition?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to understand that there are people who are opposed to foreign wars in the sense of what we saw during the global war on terror. There are like people, I think you and I are definitely in this category, opposed to the so-called forever war, or heaven forbid, World War III. We're against boots on the ground. We're against nation building. We're against, all stuff of that nature. We're against prolonged U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts. That's that's something different than using military force. Using military force doesn't necessarily, if you drop one bomb somewhere, is that a war? You know, is that World War III? No, it isn't. Of course, that can lead to a war, and that's why some level of prudence and caution are certainly warranted by whenever it comes to the use of military force. But this is an example of Trump's foreign policy, kind of at its use of military force. I'll say at its best. People forget Trump just kind of blew up ISIS. ISIS isn't really a thing anymore because Trump just dropped a ton of bombs on them. And surely there were other factors. But this is kind of what we've seen with Trump's use of military force. If there are people causing us problems, we blow them up. We don't have to send boots on the ground. We didn't try to bring democracy to the ruin to Iraq, I guess the second time, and the other parts of the Middle East where the Islamic Caliphate once operated. No, we just kind of blew them up, and things returned to I don't want to say normal. There's not much of a real normal in the Middle East, but
sure,
yeah, you didn't have ISIS to deal with anymore. So I think that there is anyone who is taking issue with Trump blowing up these narco terrorists is if they're on the right, ostensibly on the right, these are people that are just kind of almost categorically opposed to using the U.S. military to defend U.S. interests. Now, I can think of very few other things, John, that are as in line with American interests than preventing drugs from entering our country and killing the people responsible for bringing them in. So Rand Paul said I saw his tweet. He posted some study or article that alleged that only 80% of the boats that have either been struck by Trump or I think apprehended coming over here from Venezuela had drugs on them. Well, that's a pretty high rate. So and for the 20%, I guess those would be narco terrorists who don't have any drugs on the ship yet or something of the sort. Well, I'm not too sad to see them go either. So this is absolutely a wise and a justified use of military force, and anyone who's against that is probably just against the U.S. using any military force. And that's not America first. That's not MAGA. These people like, Rand Paul and Massey and whatever else, they're grandstanding. That's really not part of the Trump movement.
It's absolutely right. It's disgusting to see people who were never allied with it in the first place or supportive of it come out and declare that like Trump has somehow betrayed the base or betrayed what he originally ran on.
Right.
I mean, you remember the rallies just as well as I do. He would get up there and say, I would simply like bomb the shit out of them and everybody would lose their minds. Like everybody was aware of this sort of strategy of like, yeah, there are these people over there doing what they're not supposed to do. We're going to just like blow them up. Now, we're not going to stay and try to like build, a democracy or the Department of Education or something in the Middle East, but we will blow them up and we will like make that cease to be a problem. And then we will establish withdrawal timelines. We will get out of Afghanistan. We will end regime change programs in Syria. And so we will like act in the interest of Americans and against the more typically neoconservative kind of foreign policy that's dominated for the past 3 decades or so. And that's another thing is like how illiterate people are to like what these words even mean. I remember I did a video like 5 years ago that was, John Doyle takes the political compass test. And I took that stupid test and I ended up being graphed like right and then up, which put me in the blue. And people saw that and they saw that George W. Bush is also in the blue. And I remember seeing comments with like an alarming number of likes saying like, oh no, John's a neocon. And I'm just like thinking like, you've watched me enough to click on a video that says John Doyle takes the compass test. Like you apparently care like what I think about things. Then you watch me answer all the questions and more or less like agree with my answers, or at least, understand them. And then you think that I like jumped out of nowhere and actually am a neocon because it was like displayed in the top right quadrant or something. And so I've seen people use this word as a pejorative to describe Trump. And I don't think neoconservatism is good, by the way, but I would like you to sort of, again, kind of alluding or calling back to the timeline that you grew up in politically versus we grew up in politically. Like, what is neoconservatism actually? Is using military force in any instance, is that equivalent to neoconservatism? Is it directionally neocon? How does that align? Why is it that some of the most like profound neocons themselves hate Donald Trump? Why do they feel like their administration of the party, their interests are being threatened by Donald Trump if he is really just like a neocon or even a neocon light?
Sure. Well, that's a good question. And I'll start off by saying that the use of military force is by no means inherently neoconservative. You can look at various forms of political philosophy on the right, even on the left, that advocate for varying levels of the application of military force, and they're not neoconservative. So, yes, it's true that the neocons were very hawkish on foreign policy. But again, you can find non-neoconservative forms of political philosophy and ideology that are that are also hawkish. So there's a difference between being hawkish, which is just like a vague general perspective to have on foreign policy, where you typically lean in favor of the application of military force. That's what it is to be hawkish. Now, neoconservatism is hawkish, but in a more specific way. Neoconservatism, you had basically 2 eras of it. Without going, too far down the rabbit hole, you had the Cold War era neocons. They were very concerned with Soviet buildup. They were far more focused on that than they were on domestic stuff. Some of them would chide the paleocons and the kind of the old right types for being more concerned with sort of domestic issues like the rise of transgenderism or mass immigration when,
Sure.
the Soviets are doing this, X, Y, and Z. Obviously, the Soviet Union was a problem, but the neocons, especially this first wave, well, not especially, but this first wave, definitely they were, to the left on domestic issues as well of the old right. And that's important to keep in mind. They were more okay with the welfare state. They were more in defense of immigration, more in defense of kind of bourgeois society, right? A commercial society versus what we would, consider a traditional society. Then you had the second wave, which was after the Cold War. And this is kind of what a millennial old head like myself sort of grew up with. This is the Bush era stuff. This is, the Cold War is gone, but there's still fear mongering about Russia. And a lot of it had to do, with the global war on terror. It was the idea that America is carrying out kind of a messianic mission on the world stage, that we have a messianic role to play, that we are bringing liberal democracy, the light of, enlightened values across the world. That's how you end up with nation building. One of probably the worst thing that we did during the global war on terror was settled, like kind of entrench and try to bring these people, like bringing feminism to the women of Afghanistan or something. Well, you saw what happened the second that we pull out. The country reverted to exactly how it was before we went in there, almost overnight. I remember seeing videos of people just like storming in from the hills outside of Kabul, and it's just like, we were never there. So that's the important thing to keep in mind. Neoconservatism was about global liberalism. And yes, there was a pro-Israel element to that, absolutely. But if you look into what Bill Kristol has said, for example. Bill Kristol has been very critical of Netanyahu. Why? Because he's at odds with these sort of liberal ideals.
Yeah.
So that's a good overview of the situation. But just being hot, you can be hawkish, and that can be the wrong position, by the way, in a certain context, without being a neocon. You can also be pro-Israel without being a neocon, and that doesn't mean that there aren't valid critiques of that position as well. But neoconservatism is something more specific. And I'll be honest, if you guys out there, I know people like throwing that term around, anyone above 100 IQ who's read like half a book on this subject is probably just going to write you off as an idiot if you're using the term too loosely, right? And again, you want to bash someone for being too hawkish, or you think they're pro-Israel and that's not the right, you disagree with their pro-Israel position. Just say that. Using neocon as just like a general term is very dumb.
Yeah, I think that you really hit it on the head there with the nation building thing being like quintessential. Of course, a lot of these conservatives were themselves like former Trotskyists who then come over to the right for whatever reason. And so they retain this kind of like Marxist libtard impulse that everybody's equal, blank slate, and therefore we can export civilization and democracy to the rest of the world because everybody's interchangeable. And so this is not only possible, but is actually just and correct. And it is a good use of our time to do such. Whereas Donald Trump is not temperamentally or philosophically, obviously, sympathetic to these ideas. And you see that reflected not only through his foreign policy, but through his immigration policy. I mean, we just saw that video of him discussing Somalia. He's very willing to describe parts of the world that are uncivilized as such. He does not think that these are people who have simply not had correct access to education or money or aid or whatever. He understands that, very simply, you have parts of the world which are going to be the way they are. We are the way we are. And that's life. What are you going to do about it? And so his foreign policy and his immigration policy seem to both follow quite coherently that vector of understanding people are different, cultures are different, and that's fine. It's not bad. It's not immoral to say that. It's simply like reality aligned. But the other side of that is that we cannot waste our time and our money as Americans trying to change that, trying to police the world or govern the world to be more like us, because it's simply just not the case.
You're absolutely correct. Yeah, again, neoconservatism entails a lot more than using military force. And you kind of see the the two sides of the same coin, so to speak, with neoconservatism. Invade the world, invite the world. Both are based on this idea that people are interchangeable. Both are based on the idea that you can bring people over here and you can turn them essentially into liberal, enlightened white people. And also that you can export that ideology over there and you can turn them into kind of liberal white people over there as well. And both, some level of assimilation is possible, but it's very clear that many parts of the world don't want they don't want, LGBT rights and women's rights and whatever else. And I don't really blame them. And it's just, even if they did want them, they can go do all of that on their own. The idea that should be some kind of guiding mission or ethos for our country, for Western civilization, even more broadly, is completely insane. So I mean, the neocons, a lot of them moved over to the Democrats. Bill Kristol endorsed Mamdani. So clearly there's something else going on here other than the use of military force and Israel. And I would encourage people to, again, be a little more precise with their language. And, there's nothing wrong with actually trying to understand what these words that you're using mean. There's actually quite a bit of merit to that.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting to see that word resurfaced as a way of attacking Trump when, I mean, if you remember, not only was this going on in 2016 when Trump would outline this very just America first kind of stance on foreign policy and issues in general, but even now, like to this day, like you mentioned with these neocons, like the people who you would regard to be like the figureheads of that entire like movement or school of thought are all like extremely anti-Trump or have reluctantly, in very few cases, become Trump tolerant, maybe even pro-Trump suddenly, because they kind of understand how politics works. They understand Trump is a guy who likes to make deals. He likes it when people are nice to him, when they're loyal to him. And so they have reluctantly, entered into that camp, hoping that he does not actually manage to succeed in like totally rewriting the way that Republican politics has existed in this country in the 21st century. And so I'm excited. I'm not quite yet tired of winning. Patrick, thank you for joining the program. Tell the people where they can find you if they would like to hear more about how to restore order and things of that nature.
Right. Thank you, John. So people can go to patrickcasey.com. That's my Substack. That's where I occasionally post articles, but post the weekly podcast. They can also follow me on Twitter at Restore Order USA. Thank you again.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. We need Twitter posters and we need podcasts, and we got them. No more. We don't need any new Twitter accounts. We don't need any new podcasts.
This is
me
the
and
last
Patrick and all of our
podcast.
friends. We got it.
Yeah, we got Rufo and Lomez in here. The John Doyle Show. We're good. We don't need any more.
Yeah, the ladder is up and it's not coming back down. So just enjoy the content. Patrick, thank you again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll get you out of here. We've got very important stuff we're going to be discussing on Friday. If you know, you know. We would love you to join us. And also, please leave your questions in the comments. We will be going through those, picking the best questions or the stupidest questions. If it's like an average question, unfortunately, you will be omitted for the sake of good content. But leave your questions. We're going to be doing Q&As on Friday. Also, go to wherever it is that you get podcasts. Apparently, there's a whole world of people out there who live differently than myself. Incomprehensible to me, but apparently it's real, or so I'm told. Go to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Tell us how much you love us or how much you want me to do things to myself that I cannot elaborate on that would be, dangerous because you hurt my feelings on the internet. And I can't stand that. When people are mean to me on the internet, I'm beside myself. So if you would like to participate in either my mental well-being or disintegration, go leave a review at those places. Again, lots to discuss Friday. Very important. We'll see you then. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you. God bless your family. God bless America. And we'll see you in a couple days.